Hello everybody, this is Zero Day, and this is the RCE web app scenario in the Cloudgoat series. Unlike with other scenarios, this scenario starts off with two users because there's two different ways to escalate your privileges within the environment. With one user, you can simply query an S3 bucket that contains a private SSH key, and you can just use that SSH key to SSH into an EC2 instance. And that EC2 instance contains a high privileged role that once you get the credentials for, you can then query a different S3 bucket to obtain the credentials for an RDS instance. Then you just log into that RDS instance and you can get the secret values that are stored within the instance. The other user has the permission to query an S3 bucket that contains logs for an elastic load balancer. And this log contains a URL that you would otherwise not be able to find. So you just are able to query that from discovering it within the logs, and then you get RCE onto the EC2 instance, and from that stage onwards, everything is the same. So let's jump right into it. We were provided with two users this time, Lara and McDuck. So let's put their credentials in the AWS credentials file with AWS configure profile Lara. And we could put in the access key and secret key. So let's put an access key, secret key, and same thing with McDuck. McDuck, access key, secret key. And a thing I like starting out with this AWSealion tool is just making sure that I first set my engagement with AWSealion --set engagement, and then let's name it RCE web app. And what this will do is that any command that I run, any AWS API call, gets recorded in this directory. So let's just do AWS STS get-caller-identity. Now this is an API call that I like running when stealthiness is not a problem. So let's do profile Lara just to make sure that we put the correct access key and secret key, that we copied it correctly. And we did for Lara and McDuck. Everything looks good. So now we can just continue our pen test. So let's start off with McDuck. Let's just run a couple of commands. So he is an IAM user. Let's then do maybe list roles, see if he can do something like that. Is McDuck, not allowed to do that. Can we list the policies? We can't, so let's try EC2, describe instances, profile McDuck, and specify the region of US-East-1. And we can do that. So we have an EC2 instance here with, let's see, this IP address, and we see this is the key pair, and what else? Anything else of interest? There is the security group here, so we can assume that SSH is open and HTTP as well. So let's just test that out really quick. Let's try SSH, this IP address, and we see that it is open. It only allows keys, which is very common with EC2 instances. Now let's try the HTTP, and curl is not returning anything, and that's because the security group probably does not allow our IP address to query this HTTP application. So let's move on with some other services. How about Lambda? List functions, profile McDuck, and region of US-East-1. And that does not work. How about S3, profile McDuck, and that does. So there's hundreds of services that AWS offers, and just manually inputting that is not only annoying, it's very, very tedious. So there is a tool called Enumerate IAM. And what this will do is that just brute force your potential API calls that you can run. If it doesn't return an access denied exception, if it does not return this access denied exception, then it is assumed that you can run that command. So when we run this, we need the access key and the secret key. So let's put the access key of McDuck and his secret key, dash secret key, and put that in. And let's also specify that we are only interested in US East 1, and that will just continue brute forcing. So while that does its magic, we will look at these S3 buckets and see what we can look at. So S3, let's do this key store. So we see that we have what looks like it's probably a private key, an SSH private key, and its associated public key. So we could potentially use this to SSH into this EC2 instance. But before doing that, let's look at the other S3 buckets. So we also have this Cloudgoat logs bucket. Let's see if we can enumerate that. We cannot. And how about this Cloudgoat secret bucket? And we can't do that. So let's just take the private key from this S3 bucket, and let's copy it and put it in our current directory. So we have now downloaded this file. So let's now SSH into that EC2 instance. So SSH-I Cloudgoat, and let's assume that it's an Ubuntu instance and put in our IP address for that EC2 instance, which was right here. SSH and change mod to this file. And now let's try again. And it was an Ubuntu instance, and now we're in. I mean, if you did an nmap scan, you could also know that it's Ubuntu. If Ubuntu didn't work, then you could also do ec2-user, which is also very common. But anyways, now that we are in this instance, we can curl our IP address, our metadata with curl 169.254, get the latest endpoint, and then get the role that's attached to this instance. So we see that there's this IAM endpoint, which only exists if a role is attached to this instance. So we have IAM and security-credentials, and finally we will have this role here, EC2 role RCE web app. So we can take this, and then we get the access key, secret key, and token for this role, and we can take this and put it in our own profile. And we can take this and just do AWS configure -- profile EC2. And this wouldn't be a problem because we're not worried about stealthiness, but because we already have access to this instance, we might as well just run API calls from within this instance. And also, considering that there are some security groups involved in this entire environment, maybe this EC2 instance can query a certain IP address, but my home IP address cannot due to security groups. So we will just stick with this EC2 instance. And let's see, does it have AWS? So let's install it. Install. And while this runs, let's look at the output of our enumerate IAM tool. So we see that we can describe instances for RDS. So let's just do that really quick while AWS installs. So AWS RDS describe -db instances for profile of McDuck and region of US-East-1. And we see that there is one. We don't know the credentials, but we do know the username is cgadmin, and it's using Postgres. So this does have a security group, and it's possible that that using our home IP address, we're not allowed to connect to this RDS instance. but we can connect to it through our EC2 instance. And that's very common as well when you're running an application within an EC2 instance, that you wouldn't want just anybody to access an RDS instance. You would only want your EC2 instance to use it because that's the only thing that needs to use it. So we see that that might be the case here, and we can verify that later once this is done installing. So it didn't in fact finish. So let's do AWS RDS describe-db-instances to see if it can do that. It likely does have RDS permissions. So AWS RDS describe-db instances, region of US-east-1. And it can. It's the same instance. So if you recall, there was this S3 bucket that we were not able to enumerate called Cloudgoat logs and Cloudgoat secret. So let's see if we can do that with this instance. So S3 ls, and I'm used to inputting a profile, but we don't need to do that now. So these were the buckets. So let's do the bucket that we couldn't query. So Cloudgoat logs. And we see that we can do that here. And how about Cloudgoat secret? Cloudgoat secret. And we have db.txt. So let's check what that is. So copy, which we're just downloading it. Copy /db.txt into our current directory. So now let's cat this. And we see that we have credentials in plain text. We have this username of cgadmin, which if you remember from our RDS output, that is the same username here. And we have the password of Purple Pony 2029. So let's connect to this Postgres RDS instance. So psql-h, let's put in our address, and 5432, by the way, is the default port, so we don't need to specify that. -h, and let's put the username of cgadmin and the DB name Cloudgoat -d Cloudgoat. And it is taking a while, and that is probably because of the security groups in place. So let's copy this same command and do it within the EC2 instance. And we see that we can, so let's put in the password of Purple Pony 2029. And we are now inside of the RDS instance. So let's do /dt to list the tables, and we see sensitive information. This is a table of Cloudgoat admin. So let's select everything from the sensitive information table. And we see that the super secret password is victory and all of these characters. So that was the pathway for McDuck on how to compromise at least the RDS instance, which was the goal for this scenario. So now let's switch over to Lara. So as the Lara user, let's see if we can also list the buckets. So AWS S3 ls profile Lara. And we can do that as well. So we could do the key store. We can enumerate that as the McDuck user. We can enumerate secret as the EC2 profile, but not as McDuck. So let's see if we can just jump and do that as the Lara user. AWS S3 ls, and access denied as expected. So let's check out these logs. Let's see if we can do that. Accidentally executed the same command, but as you can see with AWSealion, this API call did not get recorded by CloudTrail because this was run straight from memory. AWSealion recognizes when you run a command that was already ran, and so it only reads the output from memory without passing the API call to the AWS account that you're targeting. So anyways, let's just continue with enumerating this S3 bucket. And we see that we can do that. So let's copy these Cloudgoat load balancer logs. So there is a load balancer within this environment. So let's just copy the logs here. So dash dash recursive, copy it all in the current directory. And we downloaded the files. We see we have these load balancer logs, AWS logs. And there is this elastic load balancer access log test file. Nothing interesting. We see that there's probably an application involved. It's an application load balancer, most likely. So let's go into elastic load balancing. There was another file right here. And let's check this out. So we have it querying where the get requests to this site. A bunch of those here. So let's curl this and see what happens. Curl this. Cannot resolve host. So let's list the elastic load balancers within this environment. So we could do that with AWSealion v2. That's just the newer version. If we look at the difference between version 2 and the regular version, is that if we do AWS ELB help, we see that it supports 3 types of load balancers: application, network, and classic, while ELB v2 supports application, network, gateway, and classic. So it's just a newer version. We may as well use it. So AWS ELB v2, and we want to describe the load balancers in our environment. Again, if you're ever unsure on which commands you can run within a certain service, you could just do the service name and then do help, and you will see all the different commands that you can run within that service. So let's describe the load balancers here with the profile of Lara and the region of US-East-1. And we see that we can do that. We have this DNS name. It is in fact an application load balancer. And it seems that is about it. So let's just go to this DNS name, and I'll go to Brave, paste that in. And we see Gold Star, Executive Interstellar Travel Rewards. Welcome, fellow travelers. Please visit the secret URL which is included in the instructions in the welcome letter you received. So we do have access to the log, so let's see if a secret agent did in fact query the secret URL. So we can find that here. Where are the logs? Less 555. So if we look at all the get requests here, we have fave icons. So this is just the logo of the site. We do have this very strange secret looking URL. So let's copy this, paste it in. It says the site cannot be reached. If we paste that HTML part to the end of this, let's see, mk copy, and we paste it at the end here, and we see that we are in fact redirected to the secret URL, this secret page. Please follow the instructions in the welcome letter you received by post and do not enter any other commands. Run your personalized login command below. So, who am I? Let's run that. Run signup command. And we see that we are root. If we do ls, this is all the contents in this current directory. I'm actually curious what file is before we try getting a shell on here. Cat file.txt. Okay, so just an IP address. So then let's try getting a shell on this system. And so there are many different ways. You could try getting a reverse shell through ngrok. You can try, we did see that there's SSH, so we can just try putting an SSH file within the Ubuntu user. So if we look at /home/ubuntu, we see that there is an SSH directory. So ls/home ubuntu.ssh, and there's this authorized keys file. So let's create our own SSH file and then save our public key within this authorized keys file. So let's go here, ssh-keygen. And the reason I'm going to use ed25519 is because this is a very small private key and public key, and this will allow us to echo the output of our public key to this authorized keys file. Otherwise, you may run into some truncation issues. So let's do this. Let's call it ID RSA, and we see this is our private key. Quite small, and even smaller is our public key. And this end part we can just leave out, so let's just echo this into the authorized keys file. So echo this into /home ubuntu ssh authorized _keys, and it looks fine. So now let's SSH using this file as ubuntu at, and what was the, let's go into our AWSealion directory to see what was the IP address of that EC2 instance. So if we do find grep IP address, or was it, or grep-r IP address, I mean, it was this. This AWSealion tool just saves all your commands. So you can just go into Lara. You see that she did ELB-v2, S3, and STS. And you look at McDuck and you see IAM, RDS. You could just go into any one of these directories and see the TXT file. Anyways, let's put this EC2 instance in here. And we are now inside of the EC2 instance. And basically, the way to go from here to the RDS instance is the same thing. You get the credentials from the db.txt file. Everything is just the same from here on. So anyways, thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.